My name is Douglas Meyer with the Ocean Project. I should be the first one listed there on your screen. It's my pleasure to be hosting this webinar today. We do have Kelly and Katie from Mystic Aquarium who are going to speak to their role in the pilot. Melanie and Melanie, Melanie without an E from Seattle and Melanie with an E from Texas State Aquarium, and they'll be doing the same. So without further ado, the little bit of quick background. Most of you know the Ocean Project, so I'm going to just skip over this and just to provide you context as to why is the Ocean Project interested in this sort of work. And the reason is that we did an extensive public opinion research, including and up through 2014. And at that point, we really started to look at, and as many of you may know, we went back to NOAA, who was our primary funder for that national level market research. And we said, if we're really going to move the needle, we're not going to see those changes necessarily at the national level. And we wanted to support our partners, the zoos, aquariums, and museums, those of you on this call, with some support to actually try this, to take some of the lessons we were learning and what we were seeing in that national level research, and give you some small grants. We started an Innovative Solutions Grants Plus program, and we're now doing some targeted pilot projects to really help fine tune and ground truth what we were seeing in the national public opinion surveys. So this is one of those projects, and what was unique about this pilot project is that we were really delving more deeply into the world of policy. We had done a lot of pilots, and the Innovative Solutions Grants were primarily focused on visitor engagement with the idea of focusing on the impact on the individual. We started to see in those projects there was really a lot more potential, and if we were going to affect change at scale, we had to think of how do we connect what the individual's interests and actions are up to a larger level. I think a similar conversation has been occurring within the Gnocchi network that I know a number of you are participating in. So how do you bring that up to that kind of community level or policy level or maybe corporate level, but in this case we're talking public policy. So how do we get the public into public policy? Our specific goals were we wanted to test engaging the visiting public to raise their awareness and document interest in science-based fisheries management. This is, of course, as you may have heard on some of these other calls or just know from the news, there's some thought right now that the Congress is going to be reviewing, or they are reviewing, and maybe revising the Magnuson-Stevens Act. The secondary goal is, and this has always been important to us at the Ocean Project, we really feel it's critical to do this in a way that maintains, if not improves, the guest experience. We had some indications that visitors to zoos and aquariums are, when they're there, our mantras become, they expect, trust, and appreciate information about specifically how they can help in conservation. So this is really what we wanted to do. And we also added this little bit here about recognition of aquariums' role. And this would apply also equally to zoos, or we just were testing this time in aquariums, in advancing ocean conservation. And this is really comes out of the work that we do try to connect dots, as you may take it here. This connects a lot with what the focus of AZA SAFE has been, really about getting, doing not only advancing conservation, but being recognized for it. With that, we were funded by the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation for this project, and it was implemented in a truly collaborative partnership with those on the call, Mystic Seattle and Texas State Aquarium. Earlier this year, what we decided to work on together were three things. We wanted to see if we could, well, we had the choice at the beginning. Did we want to try different messages with the same approach, or the same message with different approaches? And we went with the latter, and that was by kind of group vote. And then we wanted to employ kind of a common monitoring and evaluation approach so we could compare our results. When we get to the message framework that we tagged here, that when we get to the message framework that we have here, what we really decided to do was we knew each site's a little bit different. So we wanted to focus on basically, let's make sure each site is delivering the same core points to the message. And all of these points come out of that larger body of research, right? So we knew that some of this was work. We knew we had to connect it to a local example because people simply can't relate to the ocean being in trouble. We wanted to bring in the carryover benefits, and a little credit here to Jim out at Seattle, who really brought up this point of like, and this was, I knew, important to Mystic too, as you'll see in this, the PSA they did, that you want to bring it back to the, what does this mean for the ecosystem? What does it mean for the economy? How are people part of that picture? And this was really, then from there you could back into the role of policy. We wanted to make sure people saw themselves in that success. And you know, the visitor had to, we knew from our research, if people want to see themselves in the picture, I guess by nature we're slightly narcissistic beings. So we want to know, well, where am I in that story? So we wanted to make sure they felt included. And then last but not least, we wanted to document a show of support. That was critical because we knew that one of the things, the policy goal was from our policy advisors, such as Mr. Tom Adams on the call, we knew that in DC what was going to be critical is to show policy leaders that there was public support for maintaining these policies. The idea of them being strengthened under the current, I almost said regime, that's really bad. The current administration is, we knew was not likely. So with that, let me give you this example of what Mystic Aquarium, how they pulled this together in a PSA, and then I'll ask each site to kind of talk us through a little bit about the approaches that they chose. But here's an example just so you can see how you go from these, you know, the sites went from these bullet points into an actual message.
The ocean supports a tremendous diversity of creatures, big and small. Some small fish, such as Atlantic herring, play a big role in maintaining healthy ocean ecosystems.
Atlantic herring are important prey species for a wide diversity of animals. Whales and dolphins, marine birds, a diversity of fishes like Atlantic cod and tuna.
These herring also support an important commercial fishery here in New England, but this fish has had some troubled times.
The Atlantic herring were severely overfished in the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s.
Then people just like you started making sustainable seafood choices, and researchers and fishermen worked with policymakers to create science-based national policy that has led to the recovery of Atlantic herring populations. But there is still much work to be done. Now, Congress is reviewing how we manage our national fisheries.
It's our federal fisheries management policy that moved to rebuild those populations to what they are today. We need to keep the policy strong to be able to have fish now and into the future, both for fueling the ecosystem and for sustaining fisheries to put food on our plates.
If you agree, let your representatives know by signing a comment card before you leave the aquarium. Together, we can ensure that we have healthy oceans and sustainable seafood for generations to come.
Well, as you all can see there, I mean, just a really nice job. And in fact, I'm going to give a nice little shout out to all the sites here because we were invited to come down, the Ocean Project was, to be part of the Packard Foundation's Ocean Communications Roundtable. And they actually asked if they could show this video and talk about our messaging structure that the sites came up with together, because after doing all of their own separate research, they said essentially that this was pretty much perfect. So you don't get much higher praise than that. And I thought it was really great for aquariums to be foregrounded in that way, especially in a room filled with not only other funders, but leaders from across the conservation community, Ocean Conservancy, Nature Conservancy, and others. So just hats off to everybody there. And with that, let me turn it over to Kelly and Katie in Mystic to give us a little bit. If I can get my screen, whoop. It keeps wanting to show the video. It's that good. Maybe what I'm going to ask each side is to talk us through a little bit about this approach they chose to use when as part of this the pilot. So Kelly and Katie, can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to use the PSA approach at Mystic?
Sure. Thank you, Douglas. This is Kelly Mattis here. And we had great success with a similar PSA for the Northeast canyons and seamounts. and how the PSA that we were involved with there had really turned over to people signing comment cards and looking appreciative, as you indicated, about being able to be part of the effort. And that was, of course, to designate the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts as a National Marine Monument. So we knew that the PSA was a way that we could reach a lot of people. Obviously, it takes a lot of time to put it together in the beginning, but then once you do, you have the ability to essentially run it for a whole month and not need any additional related staff time. So that's exactly what we did during the month of April. We ran the PSA essentially in our Marine Theater show, which has California Sea Lions as the highlight. And it ran before each one of the 4 shows that was playing for the day. So we had the ability to reach about, we estimate about 75% of the people who came to the aquarium during that busy April season with the message of the PSA, and we found great response as that turned over to the comment cards, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit.
Exactly. Well, thank you. And Melanie from Seattle, did you want to talk a little bit about how you all decided on, having just been at the Seattle Aquarium on Tuesday, the tank shown here is right at in the entrance of the aquarium, and it's just beautiful. So really nicely foregrounded there. And Melanie, do you want to talk a little bit about the dive show and working in the messaging?
Yes, so along the lines of what Mystic was saying about minimizing staff time, we wanted to use an approach that would work seamlessly with our regular staff schedule. Because if it was successful, and spoiler alert, it was, we wanted to be able to continue to use this kind of messaging. We did have a debate in the beginning as to whether to incorporate it into a dive show, which you can see is the route that we chose, thinking we could get a wider audience that way. Or our other thought, which would be interesting for us to test someday, was maybe more like Texas State Aquarium's approach with a table one-on-one interaction. But again, we thought the dive show, since we have large audiences for those, could reach more people.
Great. And Melanie from Texas State, can you talk about the samples you served?
So we have done this in the past at different special events where we've served sustainable seafood samples. So we were excited to test it and actually evaluate how effective it is. So it did take a little bit more staff time, but we thought it would be valuable to have that one-on-one interaction and then kind of luring people in with food and then being able to share our message. So that's why we chose that method.
Great. And if we go here to, let me see if I can get, for whatever reason, my screen's not quite cooperating here. So let me see if I can. Oh. So let me talk a little bit about the evaluative methods we use. We really were looking at 3 different measures for whether or not approaches worked, and really not just whether an approach worked, but worked in what way. So we wanted to track the response rates for the comment cards. Again, we knew that one of the things that is needed and is likely going to be needed is to document a show of public support for keeping these policies strong. So would folks be willing to fill out a comment card, in this case, sign a postcard back to Congress, was an important measure for us. We also wanted to get qualitative staff feedback, as I think a couple of the folks just mentioned. We knew it had to work with staff and really making sure we were getting maximum benefit for minimum effort. I mean, we know you all are busy, so we all want to make the most with the least. So the last thing, we did a quantitative visitor exit surveys. And essentially this was a setup where we, on iPads, and I'll get in a little more detail here, we explored 3 topics: thoughts on sustainable seafood, perceptions of current fisheries policy, and the opinions of the role of aquariums in conservation, with a little kicker on a net promoter question about their overall experience. So did being asked to participate have any impact on their experience and their perceptions of the aquarium? And what we'll come to here is, so we kind of looked across these different methods, and the quick summary, I'm a big believer in telling people what you're going to see is, and I think what Melanie alluded to it worked. So the pilots really did support the hypothesis that aquariums can be effectively engaging visitors on these issues and be appreciated for it. As for the different approaches, what you'll see here going forward is that there are benefits to each, and costs and benefits to each. The PSA would prove to be the most effective overall, but the diver presentation actually had a little bit better message retention, and the seafood sampling by far had the best rate of card completion. So if we want to talk, I don't know, Kelly, do you want to run folks through kind of the data you all collected on your cards?
Absolutely. So we decided to actually set up two different methods for card completion. So as you see in the small picture on the bottom left, we had our typical table out. We had an educator there, and they had the cards on the table, and people were asked as they exited the Sea Lion show, where they had just seen the PSA, if they would be interested in filling out a comment card. And then you see another method on the right-hand side where we actually taped comment cards to a piece of poster on the wall. And really found we got almost double the amount of cards that were done by the wall poster method over the tabletop method. And the thought process there was that with the cards on the wall, they could really see what their real commitment was. They could see that really all you need to do is sign your name. You didn't need to engage with somebody. As we know, some aquarium visitors like to engage with folks, and some aquarium visitors just want to be, on their, do their own thing. So we did see about double the amount of cards from the wall method, which was a new test for us.
It was really great that you all did that. And I mean, all the sites really went above and beyond on this pilot project, but trying the different methods, and Seattle ended up applying that right away. Of note here, I don't want to skip over the fact that you guys got 12.5% of your visitors who saw this actually submitting a comment card. I mentioned that statistic at the Packard meeting I alluded to earlier, and you could almost watch jaws hit the floor, right? Because nobody else in the conservation world gets that kind of response rate on an ask like this. So it's really just underscores the potential for aquarium visits and zoo and science centers too, to reach people. So if you look at the numbers, I mean, this is just, remember, over the 3 days we were testing. They showed it over the entire month, but just over those 3 days, 1,300 comment cards signed to Congress. Melanie in Seattle, you want to talk a little bit about, I think that's you in the picture, isn't it? Is that you?
Me.
You had a lot to do there. So talk us through how just the comment card component.
Definitely. So the messaging was part of a larger 10-minute dive show. And we did kind of craft the messaging towards the end of the dive show, so it would roll into wrapping up, releasing the audience, and giving them a chance to come over and sign the comment cards. And if we were to do this again, I would definitely like to try having perhaps an additional staff or volunteer at the other side of the exhibit also stationed with the comment cards available, just to see if we might catch more people who wouldn't go out of their way to sign it but might still be interested. But I do have to say that obviously, as you said, different approaches with the different sites had different results. So not as high rate of folks who signed the comment cards at our site, but if I compare it to other asks that we do during a dive show, for example, inviting the audience to come and get a seafood watch card at the end of the show, this was a much higher rate of engagement. So that was cool to see.
Great. And if we go to the next, and we do have a nice question on the chat here. This would be considered education. This is not considered direct lobbying. If you notice, we don't reference the specific ask being the specific, and Tom, please correct me if I'm wrong. I know you're the expert here, but because we don't name the specific act in question or target it in favor of a candidate, it's still considered educational as opposed to lobbying.
Douglas, if I'm on, that is absolutely correct. Although when you talk about candidates, that's electioneering and not lobbying, which is a completely different area.
But still a no-no, right?
The second one is definitely a no-no. The first one you can do as a nonprofit. There's just some certain limits to it. But this is not considered lobbying and doesn't meet that threshold.
Thanks, Tom. And Melanie down in Texas, do you want to talk first of all, 62% comment card completion is absolutely outrageous. So do you want to talk us a little bit through how things went for you on the comment cards? Oh, Melanie in Texas, I think you might be on mute. Well, if we may have lost Melanie there, so let me just flag here that we have that this is, oh, you can hear her, she's there. Oh, can you speak up a little bit, Melanie?
Can you all hear me now?
Ah, there you are.
Okay, so we served 2 different types of samples. On our first day, we served large full-size red snapper tacos. And then while we were serving the tacos and while guests were eating, we had our staff members give the messaging, and then we had some messaging that was small on the tables, and it was not required to sign the card to get a taco. It was at the other end of the table where they had the opportunity to continue down and sign a card. On the second day, we decided to serve a smaller food sample. So we just served small samples on crackers, and we had a much larger messaging. So we actually had a large banner with the messaging, as well as wrap cards that we were handing out with the messaging, so that we focus a little bit more on the message and a little bit less on the food. But everyone was really willing to serve, to sign a card.
Awesome. Well, if we go through here, and you can see that, just so you can notice, you'll notice the similarity in the look of the cards, but each site was able to kind of, the consistency was in the messaging, but the sites were able to, brand them or design them to their own, to what they thought worked best for their audiences. If we look at the staff feedback, and maybe in the interest of time, let me ask each of you if you have anything to add to what's listed here, but folks can read through these main comments. And I don't know, Kelly, did you have anything to add to what's here on the screen, or anything you want to pull out maybe as a highlight?
Sure, yeah, I think the most important is that people really did express that they were genuinely happy that we had offered them the opportunity to be part of something bigger, as it says on that first bullet there. I will admit that the first time we did this, again, this is only the second, but the first time we did this, I did not think it was going to work. I didn't think that people were going to approach a table. I didn't think people were going to fill out comment cards, but I was very happily very wrong. So we've definitely learned a lot from this, and are now, this is definitely a tool that we'll be using into the future.
Awesome. And here's the feedback and these are all verbatims back from the staff, where they're in quotes, and then summarize where it's not in quotes. Melanie from Seattle, did you have anything that you would like to highlight or add to what's listed on the screen here?
I would just echo what was just said, that I really didn't know how this would go, asking our visitors to sign a comment card. It's a very different kind of ask than we've ever done. So it was very satisfying to see the response from the visitors, and even folks who didn't sign, just the general body language and feedback from the audience, that they seemed very appreciative of this conservation message. And I think it is because it's such a positive conservation message. So a lot of times we're telling folks about a problem we need to solve in the ocean and how they need to get engaged, and this felt very refreshing to have a positive story to tell and say, let's join what's already working and stay the course, as our message said.
Right, and that's a great point, Melanie, because for those on the call, that was definitively by design to keep things solution-oriented and positive. We know there's a lot of negative messaging out there, and it, for the long-term type of change that we're seeking here on this issue, really keeping things positive was a great way to go, and the staff really liked it too. So that was great. My personal favorite, by the way, was the fact that you had some survey takers who didn't necessarily want to take the survey because they said they were vegetarian and this was about fish, which I for whatever reason, I found that very funny. Jim Morton compared it to an episode of Portlandia, but that was my own little laugh there. Down in Texas, Melanie, for you, did you have anything that you wanted to either highlight or add to what was others have said, and what your personal experience was?
Sure. So our experiences were
similar to the other aquariums, everybody was really willing to take a survey when they were asked. The only thing that we wish we had done differently was including a Spanish survey and a Spanish message option, because most of our exhibits at the aquarium are done in both Spanish and English. But other than that, we had a great response.
Awesome. Well, and let's get to those exit surveys, because this is really, I think, and if others on the other sites agree with me, I think this was some of the most interesting data. And this is where I will say, you know, Kelly said she was a little nervous about asking visitors. I was a little nervous about what's going to happen when we actually do the exit surveys. And here's how we did the surveys. I sometimes skip over this part, and I'm often reminded to let you guys know how we did this. And if you have other ideas for what's worked better at your sites, please share. For the sites that have Wi-Fi, we used SurveyMonkey, and just a simple SurveyMonkey. The last question on the survey was asked if they'd received the messaging, as we'll come to in a minute. The survey was designed purposefully to take less than 3 minutes to complete on an iPad, and actually the survey completion time was spot on at 3 minutes. There was some resistance to the initial request when during busy times, and that was particularly noted at Mystic. The sites really just completely rocked it in terms of gathering exit surveys. Randomly sampled visitors as they're leaving. And in the case of Seattle, they get a little extra credit because they actually got to the level where they had a statistically significant sample size, meaning that that was enough people that they sampled enough people on their exit surveys that they actually crossed that threshold into statistical significance. We also will see as we come to, and I can go into this more detail if people want, we looked at statistical significance in the Mystic and Seattle samples. Since Texas did that shift in their approaches, we didn't do it there, but we looked at, was somebody statistically more likely to choose an answer if they were in the yes group, meaning they received the messaging, versus the no group, that they didn't receive it. And based on what you'll see, there's such a consistency in these findings, and that's what a geek like me looks for. That when you see a lot of consistency across the findings, we do see some regional differences, but overall, consistent movement, it gives us a lot, I think as a collective, a lot of confidence in what we're seeing. So here's the numbers, how it broke down. The notable here is, and this was a lesson learned for me, and a nice shout out here to Kathy and Khalil from the Seattle Aquarium, who really helped with the evaluative approaches and worked with me on that. They had a higher number of people who didn't remember. The one that made me laugh was, I don't know how in Texas you didn't remember whether or not you ate the red snapper sample, but there were apparently some who didn't remember. The other ones, we could see a little bit, there were people that they weren't sure or they skipped it. Maybe you came in a little late to the sea lion show and missed part of the video. But this is still, these are big samples that I think we can rest on, we can be really confident what we see here. Along the side, I won't read through all this. I just threw in for you all on the call. You can see, well, what did we think we were going to see going in? What did we end up seeing? And in this case, these were all agreement scale questions. So as you can see at the bottom, if people were asked if they agree, they were given the choice to strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree, or just skip the question. So we were a little worried actually that by telling people these success stories, all of a sudden they might think, oh, we don't have to worry about seafood sustainability anymore. And in fact, we saw the opposite effect. Can you guys see my cursor here? I think if you should be able to see my cursor, you can see the jump, okay? So in all the sites, we didn't see a statistically significant jump, but we definitely saw a definitive jump across all the sites in terms of more concern about the future availability of seafood from the ocean. This is familiarity with the concept of sustainable seafood, that little bit about reinforcing because of sustainable seafood choices. You look at these jumps here, statistically significant jump in Seattle from slightly agree almost up to agree. This is, remember, out of a 90-second on average engagement, a little longer in Texas, but this is not a lot of time for people to remember this. So we're pretty excited. But again, we were a little worried that what was going to happen with the sustainability of messaging. The audience exposed to it their agreement went up. Again, this is one we had seen before in our earlier research. We call it self-efficacy, people's belief that their actions will make a difference. As folks may know, one of the problems faced with climate change was that we started telling people how easy it was and just change out your light bulbs. And then there was a lot of messaging, kind of doom and gloom, that said your actions don't matter. And that really turned off the people who are most concerned. Well, we saw the opposite effect here. When we told people the stories, and again with that consistent messaging, statistically significant jumps at both Mystic and Seattle. Again, we weren't testing for that in Texas, but you see theirs jump too. If anyone has any questions, again, along the way, please just drop it into the chat, and I've got one eye over there. If you look at, this is kind of the core of our story, right? The US is starting to see the recovery of some previously overfished species. We definitely saw this jump. There did seem to be here some regional differences at play. There had been a lot of news already down in Texas about the recovery of red snapper, with kind of folks fighting over how to allocate that now larger catch. Whereas in Seattle, one of the things that folks relayed back to me and that I've seen too is, a lot of the news media and coverage has been around fish like salmon, and there have been more problematic things. So they were a little more surprised, and you saw a greater jump here. Is the US using a science-based approach to fisheries management? Another core part of our message. This is where, again, we saw big jumps in Mystic and statistically significant jump in Seattle, right? They really picked up that message that we're using a science-based approach and let's stay the course, which again that was what our policy team was telling us we wanted to relay. We didn't see a discernible difference in Texas, and I think the candor here too was it's really difficult to serve up those samples and this kind of messaging. And I don't know, Melanie and Tex, if you have anything you want to add there. But we also saw a number of people in the surveys who just skipped the policy questions in Texas. Melanie, did I have that about right?
Yeah, I think so. I think because we actually had to relay that message over and over individually as we were handing out the food, we might not have all given it to every single person, so that definitely affected it. As well as we use a different survey software, and people started to get frustrated toward the end of the survey with that software, so that might have affected it as well.
And thank you, Melanie, for noting that, because I did skip that for the sites that don't have Wi-Fi or reliable Wi-Fi connectivity, and in this case, we've used this in the past, we used offline survey software, and it did seem to be more problematic for the survey taker than the SurveyMonkey interface. So if you have on-site Wi-Fi, save yourself the money and use the SurveyMonkey. That was kind of our little side lesson. This one, and this was worked out with Kathy, and where we wanted to throw a curveball. So obviously we don't want them to weaken, probably not our best survey question, honestly. But we were worried that people would say, oh, things are getting better. We can relax our policies now. And we didn't see that happen, but it stayed kind of stagnant, which is good. And the overall good news here is for us, and as a community trying to keep these policies, is visitors don't want to see these weakened already. So we can amp that up a little bit more, maybe if we continue this, but good news, and that it didn't, neither in the individual sustainable seafood or in the collective seafood policy did we see any movement in the wrong direction. And that kind of is somewhat akin to single action bias. Now, here's the one that's the real kicker. We had seen in some of our prior pilots that engaging visitors in an action greatly impacts their opinions of aquariums as conservation organizations and leaders. And again, this would apply by extension, I would say, to zoos. And also we've done some work with much more limitedly. We'd love if there's science centers on the phone to do some more work with science centers. But same indication, statistically significant big jumps up, and whether an aquarium is helping to conserve our ocean and animals. So your role as a conservation actor. Again, we didn't see as much in Texas, which I'm kind of attributing to that difficulties in getting through all the messaging. When you redid the messaging, or when they redid the messaging on the second day, as you heard Melanie reference, we did get stronger results here. By the way, this is the overall average. Is this aquarium a good source of information about ways to help the ocean and its animals? So the question read, the Seattle Aquarium, the Mystic Aquarium, the Texas State Aquarium. Again, big bumps from already high agreement, right? So you're already starting in a good place, and you're going even higher. The actions of people like me, together with those of the aquariums and zoos, can add up to help our oceans and the animals. This is an important one for us at the Ocean Project. The messaging often is framed as, look at what the aquarium or zoo is doing, and the visitor's not part of that. When you make the visitor part of it, as we did in this pilot, you get much more benefit out of it. They bring in, they feel like not only do they appreciate that you're doing this, but the notion that this could be successful goes up. So this is like the idea of restoring some hope, where you don't hear a lot of that right now. I'm not sure if people are on the call are familiar with Net Promoter methodology. This is basically that question many of you may have been asked yourselves about a product or service. How likely is it that you would recommend that product or service to a friend or colleague? In this case, we just put the name of the aquarium. And then what you do is you take your number of people who score you a 9 and a 10, take that percentage, subtract the percentage who scored you a 6 or below. The passives go away, and that gives you a score. The idea here, after looking at this, and I'm not a huge fan, honestly, of Net Promoter scores in some ways, but it's a kind of, I'd say it's a good general test. But what's really great to see here is if you look across Mystic and Seattle, the no group that did not receive the messaging, first of all, you're already well up into the good and excellent class on this scalar. And the fact that the group that received the messaging was across the board higher does provide some suggestion. And when I dig into the data a little more deeply, what we see is a lot of these folks, right? These are their passives. The ones who are like, you ask your friend, how is that movie? And I'm like, yeah, it's okay. Probably not that doesn't really inspire you to go. Well, what we found is the idea here is or the indication at least is, if you ask people to participate in a conservation action, you may see them move from 8s to 9s. So instead of, how was that movie? Yeah, it was okay. It was, it's worth seeing. And that's, that's great. The thing to note for Texas State, by the way, here was day 1 results were, again, sometimes it depends on who you get. But the day 2 results were in keeping where the team tweaked their approach a little bit. The day 2 results are in keeping. But this note here, I would take all of this with a grain of salt, because NPS score can be relatively volatile, and by their standard, a small sample size. This is like, how likely is it you would recommend Coca-Cola? So I don't know if before we get into recommendations, let me just ask again if anyone on the call has any questions about kind of the way we approached it for either myself or any of the panelists. Okay. Well, not seeing any, we'll save some time for some questions here at the end. In terms of our recommendations, from across the sites, it was, don't be afraid to bring visiting public into public policy. I mean, there were we know so many sites and our partners have done this with individual behaviors, but I think Kelly said it, you heard Kelly, Melanie, and Melanie said, that when you get into this, you can do this in a way where if you structure your messaging, and it's the third bullet, you have to carefully craft your messaging, and it can become hard to juggle. And I think that's where the PSA was helpful in this case, because you were guaranteed to hit the messaging points. And the scripted interpretation, like the diver talk, it's a little easier to hit this kind of complicated messaging, especially when you're thinking about those lines like what's lobbying, what's not. the second bullet that I skipped over there is also important, that to design your public engagement based on your policy goal. I think sometimes we stop our thoughts in designing these programs at the individual level, what happens to the visitor. And what I really enjoyed in working on this project was thinking beyond what happens with the visitor and to what was needed on the policy front. And then together with, as a group, we shaped this approach. Choose the most appropriate engagement approach. As you saw in these pilots, if you really need to collect cards quickly, fire up the grill. If you want to reach a large number of people and with a minimum amount of staff time, the PSA approach, and you have that sort of venue to show it, that's great. This next bullet is really to look to maximize the opportunity in scripted presentations and shows. That there is a little indication here that maybe we're getting the people who are going to most likely be engaged are coming to our presentations. They're the ones who come over to the tables. They're the ones that go to the diver talks. They're the ones that go to the sea lion show. If there's low-hanging fruit, pick it. I'm not going to worry too much about that. And the last thing is be prepared to leverage visitor interest. And by that we mean, I think there's been some expectation that we'll inspire a visitor, and the little girl in the middle here is going to hear the message and she's going to take the charge and organize a community meeting. It's maybe a little much. I think what we're seeing here is we have to be prepared to think, how are we as institutions going to pull that message up? And in that note, I see a couple of questions here about what are we going to do with the cards once they're signed? And in this case, Kelly, you want to talk about that? I mean, this was a pilot, so we were really just testing the approach here. But
hi, this is actually Katie from Mystical.
Oh, hi, Katie.
Hey, and so for us, it was actually, this was in many ways very important to us, what to do with the cards. So, for example, we collected over almost 700 cards from residents of the state of Connecticut, where the majority of the Connecticut delegation are in favor of upholding the Magnuson-Stevens Act and sort of the rigorous science associated with it. There is our local representative who's been only hearing from commercial fishermen that are in support of these bills that are being put to Congress to weaken the act. So we hand delivered all of the cards to that specific representative to make sure that he is aware that a lot of the population that is in his district are in support of keeping that federal regulation strong.
So that's great. And that's a perfect example. Like if you have someone like that who they're not hearing from, and the benefit you all have compared to like the other groups that were in the room at that Packard meeting is if the Sierra Club or the Nature Conservancy goes in with 500 comment cards to a member of Congress, the messenger impacts the message. And it's very different, I think. And I mean, Katie, you've been doing this very effectively. It would seem to me that it's going to be very different if you show up with 700 comment cards than if Greenpeace shows up with 700 comment cards saying the same thing. Am I right on that?
Yeah, that's what we continue to hear, that, it's the Aquarium voice is a really, as a trusted scientific institution, is far more powerful than a voice that is seen as, frankly, biased with an agenda. So, the environmental groups have, certainly influence on the Hill and, work very closely to help enact legislation that's going to be pro-environment. But, for an institution like ours that we have a scientist who is studying fisheries, it's much more impactful for our institution to get voices and things like comment cards from the public to these representatives, and it's really powerful, and we've seen a lot of that, a lot of people taking notice to that, and it puts us in an important role where we can take the science that we're doing and translate it into management and policy.
And while I have you on that, Katie, let me ask you a follow-up question that's just come in on the chat. Do you feel like there was any, I know the cards signed said to keep sound science in fisheries policy, something to that effect. And then when you go in to meet a member and you mentioned the Magnuson Act in particular, do you feel like there was any concern? The direct question from on the chat is, can you legally direct their signatures toward a policy since that is not what they signed the card for? Technically not what they signed the card for.
Yeah, so what we did is we put together a cover letter where we specifically called out HR 200 and HR 2023, which are the bills that are out there that could weaken MSA. And we put together what our thoughts were on that from a scientific perspective. And then we explained the campaign, gave them a count of the comment cards that we collected. But, you know, I think we differentiated between what we are institutionally saying based on the science and the public engagement piece that we did.
Yeah, and I guess in this case, the member is going to see the actual card that was signed.
Yeah.
So they're gonna, great. Another question that just came in is talking about how the messages were crafted. They seem to use similar language, and they definitely do use similar language. I don't know if Melanie want to talk about this. I mean, Melanie, one thing we didn't talk about in Seattle was how you decided to bring this into the script you used for your diver talk. Do you want to maybe address how you went from those bullet points we crafted as a team to actually moving that into a talk? And I'll go back to that screen here while you do so.
Definitely part of it was a bit of trial and error at the beginning. So I had these bullet points that we had collectively agreed on and kind of used that to craft our specific message about rockfish here in Washington. And I had this great script going back and forth between the diver and the staff member on the dry side. And then we had to actually try it. And we don't use scripted shows here. So the script that I had made was good bullet points. And so we definitely tried it out before we actually started doing the visitor surveys. And we just found we had to get comfortable with the message, like with any new message, weaving it into the rest of our show.
Oh, great. And Melanie in Texas, did you have anything to add on how you went from the bullets of the message to the specifics for what you delivered down in Texas?
Sure. So ours was definitely more conversational because we were serving food to people while we were talking to them. But then the second time when we had a larger banner and rack cards that we were giving out were designed by our graphic designer, we showed her the messages and those bullet points, and then she kind of translated some of that into images, some of it into a graph, and then she made a graphic that what became our large banner. So it was both visual and then conversational, but it wasn't as scripted as, say, a film or a show.
Right, and that's, again, I mean, that's the personal interaction, which is something we've seen throughout our work with different aquarium zoos and science centers. That personal action really can't be beat for delivering the message in terms of people retaining it. I think how much they can, no pun intended, digest at one point was kind of the lesson learned here. If they're also engaged in some other activity that requires attention, like eating and serving food, and it gets a little more than they can handle. And so that simplified message. One thing for the groups on the call, I'll take a little moderator prerogative. Did you get any feedback in terms of how many people wanted to engage beyond the script? People asking more difficult questions, any more questions about it, or were they pretty satisfied at this level of messaging? And let me start with Mystic, maybe.
Sure, we didn't see any extensive ask on additional information. Remembering too that they were exiting a show and it pretty much is a flow out. So it wasn't like a tabletop like some of the other opportunities were. It really was kind of an exit out of the theater. They certainly could stay, but it wasn't an area you really would do that.
Great. And out in Seattle or down in Texas, anything to add on that? Did you find that you had, let me ask you down in Texas first on this one, Melanie, because I know the issue of red snapper, which is the fish used as your local example, was much more contentious.
Yeah, so we were even hesitant to choose red snapper just because it has been a little bit contentious down here with how to allocate it between recreational and commercial fisheries. But we didn't, so we were worried about getting pushback, but we didn't get really any pushback. So no one asked, further questions. They were kind of happy with the messaging that we'd given.
That's great. And I don't know if there's anything to add, Melanie, from Seattle on this point.
We did encounter that, not very many folks at all, but a small handful of people who grew up around here and remember fishing for rockfish and the decline that rockfish went through around here. They did have the follow-up questions of, well, are they coming back? Is this policy working? And part of that is definitely also the difference between national policy and on the federal level, rockfish being recovered, whereas right here in our waters around Seattle, still being not fishable. So that was something that we could get further into with folks. A few people were curious about that or maybe frustrated. And the one visitor that I talked to, he was actually satisfied at the end of our interaction.
Oh, good. And I'm seeing a couple of folks are raising their hands, and unfortunately, I'm having a hard time following that. Could I ask if you could use your chat feature to type in your question quickly, with apologies for that? I'm having a hard time, for whatever reason, seeing where to address raised hands on this. And while we do that, let me just add from our policy guru, Tom, that in terms of what they were looking for us, what our charge was as the pilot sites, was that the message to deliver to Congress was intended to preserve this idea of a bipartisan science-based approach to managing fishery. And there are bills pending right now in both houses with a vote expected on the House version that may happen as soon as later this month or July. And so, as you may notice, we actually decided together as the sites to just focus on the science-based approach and kind of keep out of the bipartisan nature, just because things have become so partisan. We really didn't even want to, raise something that might inspire questions. We decided to focus on the science, which also was seen as, I think the sites all agreed, was more brand appropriate. So I know I saw like Allie and Mark and Tom had raised hands. Were there questions associated with those? I want to make sure to address them if there were.
Yeah, Douglas, this is Tom. I'll be really brief.
Sure.
Good summary of what's going on with the Magnuson Act, and really what those of us who are paying attention to it are hoping is that Congress takes no action, because our feeling is whatever the existing laws is probably much better than what they could do. And I want to back up to an earlier part of the conversation. I can tell you, as a former congressional staffer and also a lobbyist for some national groups and a lobbyist for a zoo, when an organization like a zoo or an aquarium shows up in the office with this sort of stuff, it definitely gets your attention more than the groups that regularly do it. So these results would not surprise me being translated to once they're delivered to Congress. And I think Mystic has had some really good experience on that recently as well. Thanks.
Great. And did I miss anyone else's questions there? Or I want to make sure each of our panelists also has a chance to add any final comments or thoughts. So any other questions from anyone who's on the call that you want to chat in, or you can always email us afterwards as well. Okay, not seeing any other questions. Let me just go around the horn and Kelly and Katie from Mystic, is there anything that you'd like to add or kind of a final word of comment?
Sure. I would just say that what I really appreciated about this pilot was the opportunity to test the different ways of delivering a common message. I think that's something that we don't explore enough, and I think it's introduced us to thinking about some broader ways to get out the same message to our public. So really appreciated that about the project, and something I think we'll keep up on.
Yeah, it was a real, I'm going to add on that, it was a real pleasure to do that from our standpoint too, because I think each of this, not only each of you all, but for those on this call, we can share out, hey, we tried, the way you all stuck to the same messaging, and we really controlled the variables, and the main variable between the sites, it was really, I think you got more out of what you just put into it by doing that. So that's great to hear. Going down let's go out to Seattle. We'll stick in alphabetical order. And Melanie, did you have any final comment or piece of advice?
Just that this was a really positive experience. So I'm glad we got to participate, and yeah, I'm excited to use similar messaging in the future to know that we can engage our visitors in this way.
Okay. Yay. And a plug there to, if you have not registered for AZA in Seattle, please do so, and don't miss the icebreaker at the Seattle Aquarium. How's that? All right. And down in Texas, Melanie, did you have anything, final piece of advice or?
Yeah, I would just echo that it was a really positive experience for us as well. For us, it was great to have that one-on-one interaction and conversation with our guests about a topic that we don't normally touch on. We don't normally touch on policy, but we are excited and surprised to see that it was so positive.
Yeah, and real kudos to Texas, because we knew you were walking out into the crossfire on this one, because for those on the call who may not have seen this, the red snapper issue has become, of the three, I think easily the most contentious in terms of potentially contentious, and the willingness to step up and do that, and really to take on the extra burden of doing the food service along with the messaging, was greatly appreciated. So, well, that's all for us here at the Ocean Project. I want to thank Tom for letting me kind of take over his webinar series for the day. And yes, we will be putting out the webinar. I've hopefully not messed that up, and recorded the whole thing. And so the presentation, this webinar will be available. And we're also working on having the presentation and writing up kind of a quick blog summary at the more one-page level if you want to share it with friends or colleagues. But all three of those will be made available for everyone in the Zoom Aquarium community. So thank you. Tom, do you have any final words to close us out, since this is your series?
Thank you, Douglas. I think this was great. And the one thing I would just sort of add is I think this is for those of you who are interested in getting into policy communications with your guests, I think this is a great way to do it. It is, I think, a way that zoos and aquariums are comfortable communicating with their guests, and it's just adjusting the message, the content of the message a little bit, directing in a slightly different direction. So thanks, Douglas, and I look forward to seeing you guys at a future webinar the next time we have one scheduled, and we're working on that now.
Okay, well, great, everyone. And thanks so much for joining us. And any comments or suggestions for how we can continue to produce webinars that are helpful for you and your work, please don't hesitate to share those. So thanks again, and have a great day.